Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Talks with Walt, as we are calling our readings through the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We now are going to do a real brief introduction to the 11 poems of a section called Sea Drift. Now it's interesting the number of people who are lovers of reading Leaves of Grass who will always talk about poems like in the collection Song of Myself, or maybe Song of the Open Road, and poems that are a little bit more better known and popular. But it's always people who study Whitman who want to talk about the Sea Drift poems, especially the first two, and of course they love to talk about Lilacs, Last in the Dooryard Blue. When I got ready to give this series of archive talks, in fact, several of my pals who spend quite a bit of time studying Whitman, they began to ask me right away, how are you going to deal with Out of the Cradle Endlessly Rocking? Why? Because for many of us, this is the central poem in all of Leaves of Grass. Not to say it's the most important poem, not to say it's the best poem, but there's something fundamental that's really important that's happening. Now these 11 poems, just to get them out of the way, I mentioned Out of the Cradle Endlessly Rocking, sometimes simply referred to as Cradle. As I Ebbed with the Ocean of Life, another poem which resonates, and I think will for many of you guys as well. Then the third poem is Tears, followed by To the Man of War Bird. We're going to talk about the movement from the individual, the shift, the movement from the individual to the ship and the boat here in a bit. The fifth poem is Abroad at the Ship's Helm. The sixth poem is On the Beach at Night, followed by The World Below the Brine. The eighth poem is On the Beach at Night Alone. Poem 9 is Song for All Seas, All Ships. And then finally the last two poems, Patrolling Barnegat and After the Sea Ship. Now this set of poems sits in between Birds of Passage and a Broadway Pageant, which we finished, and then we'll work with By the Roadside to precede By the Roadside, and then of course Drum Taps to follow. Now our assumptions here are vital. We want to pay attention to, of course, our learning theory. That is to say, we're always trying to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways. And because that's such an important thing, our annotative theory, as we've articulated so many times, you can find all of our lists there at learnstrong.net. Down that left-hand side, Talks with Walt, we're calling this series of conversations. We're always asking three guiding questions, and we'll definitely do that with these 11 poems as well. What does the text say? What does the text mean? How can I relate to this text in some meaningful way? At level 1, what does the text say? I'm simply asking, what is the summary that we're trying to gain here? At level 2A, themes, messages, motifs, and the like. And at 2B, we're asking the rhetorical ideas. Now, what is said, but how it's said. For example, in Out of the Cradle Endlessly Rocking, we're going to have a very interesting question about the voices, and we'll get back to this here in a little bit. Finally, at 3A, can I relate to other texts? Now, for those of you who have been reading with me from the very, very first, all the way from inscriptions up through and including all of the lines of Leaves of Grass to Broadway Pageant, then there is a moment when you're going to say that Out of the Cradle Endlessly Rocking is unlike anything that we've read to this point. And I think we can make that argument, and I'll try and make it. But at the same time, we're going to look at it and say, man, there's just so many echoes from what's happening and transpiring earlier in the deathbed edition of Leaves of Grass. So we're going to try to position this set of 11 poems right in the center, and that's in fact where we are now. We are in the center. For those of you who have been reading and studying with me all along, congratulations, you are coming to the summit. I mean, here we are. We're coming to the very middle part of Leaves of Grass, and so there is a congratulatory note that I need to pass on. Maybe we'll hear that bird singing for us as well, and we'll be ready to start thinking about triumph, transformation, jubilant as we move towards the end of Leaves of Grass in this famous End of Day poem. There's another assumption as well, that we are looking at Whitman from multiple perspectives. We call it our Big Five. What does the text say about epistemology, what we can know? And we've argued that instead of an absolutist position, I am right and you are wrong. Although certainly Whitman at times can seem to take that position. Or the relativist position that says there is no right, there is no wrong, and it seems that at times Whitman can take that position as well. It is really epistemologically the fallibilist position. I think I'm right, but I could be wrong, that makes reading Whitman so powerful. The second of our Big Five is the other side of that coin of epistemology, ontology, and the question of who we are. Now, here we're going to, in this set of 11 poems, find Whitman again struggling with the question of his own identity. Who is he? And what is it that he knows? Is he a poet, or is he simply an aspiring artist poet? And that's always a question, I think, when we're reading Whitman. Our 3 and 4 of our big 5 go together as well. Psychology, the study of the individual mind. Sociology, the study of the collective group, the collective mind, and we'll be asking about that one as well. And then finally, and I think really precious and pertinent for our study of Seadrift poems, is this question of the big 5, number 5, theodicy. That is to say, theo, God, dike, justice, in the Greek. In other words, why must there be pain and suffering in this world? And what is the value of it? And can it in fact be a propedeutic, as we have pointed out, that is to say, instructional, didactic? We no longer will ask, why did this happen to me, but rather, why did this happen for me? We're going to see this right away in the very first poem of Cradle, where you're going to see what, to borrow from a title that we love so much in 303, James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. I think that we're going to see Whitman trying to come to terms with himself and his young voice. We have as well said in our assumptions is that we're looking at all kinds of perspectives on Whitman. We've called them the 5 Ps. Whitman as poet, Whitman as politician, Whitman as philosopher. You're familiar from all of these different perspectives, and we'll be looking at all of them as well as we move. Now, we'll as well listen to Norton's, who's giving us some background information here. Seadrift, this group of 11 poems compiled in Leaves of Grass 1881 included the 7 poems of the Seashore Memories cluster in the 1871 Passage to India, 2 new poems, and 2 poems transferred from the 1876 Two Rivulets. The new group is one of the poet's most consonant arrangements held together by the impression, deep in childhood memory, of the sea and the beach, an influence which is at the heart of his acceptance of the tragic in life. And of course, we're back then to this idea of theodicy, right? The tragic in life. And we've pointed this out. Whitman did say in his journals, a line that we've quoted often, that he likes to live on the sunny side of life. No question about that. He is an optimist. But as we've said, he's an informed optimist, not a blind optimist. I think to call Whitman just a blind optimist is to misread Leaves of Grass. It's obvious from any number of passages we've already studied the way in which Whitman struggles with some of the pain in his life, and some of that pain is going to come out in a number of these poems in Seadrift. So we'll be paying attention to that. Now, just to finish, what will be our points of emphasis? I'd like to call this introductory set of comments, and the way I think about the Seadrift 11 poems, as from Phaedo to Dry Salvages. Now let me explain what I mean by that. Well, in many ways, Whitman is going to pick up the very ancient question that is best articulated in Plato's Phaedo. We've given full lectures at learnstrong.net. There is Socrates. He is with his pals. He is looking at the very cup that holds the hemlock he soon will drink to his own death. The state is putting him to death. Of course, he is a corrupter of the youth, and he is a disbeliever in the gods, an atheist. Both of these arguments are pretty shabby arguments, right? And of course, the same 2 arguments were in fact leveled against Whitman much of his life, and of course after his life. But right before Socrates is ready to drink the hemlock, he's giddy. He's ready to go on a journey, and he's excited. And of course, the students can't understand why it is that he's so excited. And he says, well, I get to go like Odysseus on this new journey, on this final journey, but not really a final journey, because there's always a journey that's remaining. And of course, in Phaedo, he will make his classic argument for the existence of soul. Now, as we've said in that lecture, whether you agree or disagree, it is a fun question to ask. What happens once you flatline? And we're going to play a similar kind of game in these 11 poems. Of course, some of you will say, well, no, wait a minute. We were playing that game as early as Song of Myself, Passage 6. And others of you will say, wait a minute, we were playing that game at starting from Paumanok. Of course, we're going to get to Paumanok in the very first of the poems in this collection. And it's true. I mean, from the very beginning, it's clear that Whitman wanted to remind us that you don't get to swing at the park for very long because the van is always waiting. And as children, we were, of course, told, you have to go to the van. I don't want to go to the van. I want to keep swinging at the park. Honey, you can't swing at the park forever. Your time at the park is precious because the van is waiting. And Whitman will certainly be playing that game. I think there is as well clearly a shift here, and let's just point this out in this cluster, from emphasis on the land to increasing emphasis on the sea. Now, we've seen this already in Song of Myself, passage 46 and 47, and a good number of you have already said, of all the lines in Leaves of Grass thus far, the one you keep coming back to as a set of lines continues to be that Song of Myself, passage 46 and 47. Why? Because one of our 5 P's of Whitman is pedagogue, that is to say instructor. And I think it's hypercritical to realize that Whitman was constantly dealing with the fact in his own biography that he never really was that great or successful of a teacher. I think it bugged him. I think he wanted to be a teacher. I think he wanted to be a great teacher. But I think he struggled with the idea of the pedagogy of his day. And so for that reason, he becomes this journalist and then later this poet of songs. But I think in the end, the way he calls himself this chanter of songs, we're going to get to that in the very first poem, Cradle, I think Whitman was constantly wanting to challenge all of us to think about the movements of our life from land to sea. We're also going to see this as a transformation motif. We've mentioned this already. And the sea is that transformation, no question. We're going to focus on as well the poetic or the artistic voices that will be a part of this. For example, I've told you guys already that one of the reasons I'm giving this set of talks on Leaves of Grass is that I raised all 3 of my children to learn to read by giving them Leaves of Grass. Only, of course, I didn't just give it to them. I read it with them. And it was always interesting, the poems that they came to as children when they were quite young, especially, Oh, Captain, My Captain was one that they liked. The rhythms make sense. A poem we'll get to later, a poem that Whitman himself didn't always appreciate as being such an important poem in his canon. But it was always interesting when I would read to them, A Child Went Forth, and Out of the Cradle Endlessly Rocky. And we're going to see this even in my discussion when I get to Cradle. There's always the question, and I discovered it when I was raising quite young children, how exactly was I to read all out loud all of Out of the Cradle Endlessly Rocking? Why? Because there is going to be different voices. And so we're going to pay attention to these voices. And as I've said, and I hope that you guys are doing it, several of you are telling me that you are doing this, you are taking Leaves of Grass and the poems and you're reading them out loud. Whitman believed himself a chanter of songs. So the question is, can we in fact chant these songs aloud and enjoy them back and forth with each other? And I think Out of the Cradle Endlessly Rocking will demonstrate the kind of poetic voice and voices that we will find and discover all through Leaves of Grass. I think that reading the Sea Drift poems is a way to kind of come to terms with the voice and voices of Whitman. And the question of the immortality of the soul as it relates back to Phaedo. Now, again, we're going to move from birds to boats is the way I like to think of it. So put that in your notes and see if this makes sense to you. Where birds are going to emphasize the individual longings, the individual struggles of the poet-artist, and the boat is going to begin to recognize, maybe somewhere far back in his psyche, of course, is the idea of the story of Noah and his boat, the Ark of Noah, to try to save human civilization and all of that. Maybe it's there, but I think that it's clear. The individual is represented by the bird. The boat will represent the spiritual, the trans-individual. You'll remember that we've commented the way that Ken Wilber talks about that integral perspective on ethics, where we have an egocentric, I do what I want and I don't care what anybody thinks. It moves or evolves to an ethnocentric, I do what my group tells me. But then somewhere along the line, hopefully, we start to realize, well, wait, if I'd been born into a different group, I'd have a different view. And from the ethnocentric, we move to the world-centric, and here we will find the beginnings of a more integralist view. And I think this is exactly what we're going to see in the Sea Cluster poems as well. This challenge to move from simply a single individual perspective to a transhuman perspective, to a perspective of all of us, and the boat will in some ways play that game. But I'm going to finish, because I said to you guys I was going to qualify this lecture as the movement from Phaedo to Dry Salvages. I have said to you guys that you can't really read and appreciate the great T.S. Eliot, and of course Harold Bloom and I disagree on this topic. I think that T.S. Eliot is one of the greatest poets of the 20th century. And I think in many ways that modern poetry begins with Walt Whitman and ends with T.S. Eliot, and then everything beyond T.S. Eliot is what we'll call postmodern. But I've argued that you really can't read the poetry of T.S. Eliot, and especially, I believe, four quartets, without appreciating what Whitman is doing. And I think Eliot is most influenced in some ways by the 11 poems of Seadrift, especially Out of the Cradle, Endlessly Rocking. Do you remember these lines from Dry Salvages? I've given full exegesis of this at learnstrong.net. I do not know much about gods, but I think that the river is a strong brown god, sullen, untamed, and intractable, patient to some degree, at first recognized as a frontier, useful, untrustworthy as a conveyor of commerce, then only a problem confronting the builder of bridges. The problem once solved, the brown god is almost forgotten by the dwellers in cities, ever, however implacable, keeping his seasons and rages, destroyer, reminder of what men choose to forget, unhonored, unpropitiated by worshippers of the machine, but waiting, watching and waiting. His rhythm was present in the nursery bedroom, in the rank ailanthus of the April dooryard, in the smell of grapes on the autumn table, in the evening circle, in the winter gaslight. The river is within us. The sea is all about us. The sea is the land's edge also, the granite into which it reaches, the beaches where it tosses its hints of earlier and other creation, the starfish, the horseshoe crab, the whale's backbone, the pools where it offers to our curiosity the more delicate algae and the sea anemone. It tosses up our losses, the torn seine, the shattered lobster pot, the broken oar, and the gear of foreign dead men. The sea has many voices, many gods, and many voices. The salt is on the briar rose, the fog is in the fir tree. The sea howl and the sea yelp are different voices, often together heard. The whine in the rigging, the menace and caress of wave that breaks on water, the distant rote in the granite teeth, and the wailing warning from the approaching headland are all sea voices, and the heaving groan around it homewards, and the seagull. And under the oppression of the silent fog, the tolling bell measures time, not our time, rung by the unhurried groundswell, a time older than the time of chronometers, older than time counted by anxious, worried women lying awake, calculating the future, trying to unweave, unwind, unravel, and piece together the past and the future between midnight and dawn, when the past is all deception and the future futureless, before the morning watch, when time stops and time is never ending, and the groundswell that is and was from the beginning clangs the bell. It will, in fact, be this voice, this bell, this sound, this cry that we will move to now as we pick up and enjoy the 11 poems of Seadrift, beginning, of course, with Cradle. Thank you.